My name is Stephen Potoff. I'm professor of religion, philosophy, and peace studies at Wilmington College, and I'm your host for today's lecture entitled Radiation and Cancer from the Manhattan Project to Today. In my role as host, my name is Stephen Potoff. I'm professor of religion, philosophy, and studies at Westheimer College. I'm your host for today's lecture titled Radiation and Cancer from the Manhattan Project to Today. My role is host. I'm sorry, we're experiencing some temporary technical difficulties. I need to mute my computer because I'm getting feedback and I don't know how to do that. I'm sorry, we're experiencing some temporary technical difficulties. All right, we're going to try this again. I have now, I think, muted what I needed to mute. In my role as host, I am here to welcome you, briefly introduce our speaker, and be on hand to help field questions and comments as needed. On behalf of Wilmington College in Southwest Ohio of the United States, welcome to the 30th Annual Westheimer Peace Symposium, focusing on peace and the nature of war, for a special two-day symposium entitled The Nuclear Threat, Past, Present, Future, in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan by the United States. This year's symposium is a special collaboration with the Wilmington College Peace Resource Center, which holds an extensive collection of archival materials related to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the human experience in nuclear war. It is also held in collaboration with the Response Project funded by an Ohio Arts Council grant, in which 7 artists across the United States have created original compositions for the symposium in response to archival materials from the Peace Resource Center archives. I'm here for a schedule of today's and tomorrow's lectures and performances. Please go to wilmington.edu/Westheimer. A huge thank you then to our speaker today, David Richardson. Dr. Richardson is professor of epidemiology in the School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on the health effects of occupational and environmental exposures, particularly ionizing radiation. He has conducted studies of cancer among nuclear workers and uranium miners in the US and Europe, and studied cancer among the Japanese survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He has served as a visiting scientist at the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer in Lyon, France, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, Hiroshima, Japan, the Institut de Radioprotection et de Sûreté Nucléaire in Paris, France, and as coordinating writer for United Nations Committee on Epidemiological Studies of Radiation and Cancer, Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation in Vienna, Austria. He is an associate editor of the journals Occupational and Environmental Medicine, Environmental Journal of Epidemiology, and Environmental Health Perspectives. Dr. Richardson, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here on this special event commemorating the events. The talk that I'm going to give, and I'll try and let me start by seeing if I can share my screen. Okay. And I need to make that full screen if I can. I'm sorry, bear with me. Okay, hopefully that's sharing full screen. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be speaking about radiation and cancer. And the title of the talk is From the Manhattan Project to Today. The Trinity test, and this is a picture of the Trinity test, in July of 1945 in Alamogordo at the bombing range, just south of Los Alamos by a few hundred miles, was the first detonation of a nuclear weapon. It was a weapon that was unknown to humanity prior to that, fueled by a material that barely existed on Earth. At the heart of the weapon, there were two hemispheres of plutonium metal. As Brigadier General Thomas Farrell said at the time, he had signed over to handle the weapon. And he said, I recall I asked him if I was going to sign for it, shouldn't I take it and handle it? So I took this heavy ball in my hand and I felt it growing warm. I got a sense of its hidden power. It wasn't a cold piece of metal, but it was really a piece of metal that seemed to be working inside it. Then maybe for the first time, I began to believe some of the fantastic tales that the scientists had told me about this nuclear power. And the weapon was detonated there. And it was followed in early August, so very shortly afterwards, by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and then subsequently of Nagasaki. Each of the nuclear weapons was using material, in one hand uranium-235, in the other case plutonium, that were exceptionally rare, exquisitely rare, almost to the point of being non-existent prior to 1945. Which leads us to the question, where did these weapons come from and where did the material at the heart of those weapons come from? The answer to that is what was known as the Manhattan Project, which had started out just 2 years before as a secret project to make a new type of weapon. And out of that secret project grew the creation of a major new industry. The Manhattan Project eventually grew to encompass 30 laboratories and sites, and eventually recruited over 130,000 workers in different facets of nuclear research. There were 3 early primary locations: Oak Ridge in Tennessee, so not far from North Carolina, just across the border; Richland, Washington, all the way across the country on the other side, and then sort of in the middle, Los Alamos, New Mexico. So in some ways, this could appear as kind of a completely novel industry. Yet if you walk around those sites, in other ways, if you're familiar with earlier industrial production, places like the Alcoa plant in Alcoa, Tennessee, which was making aluminum around the same period, or Union Carbide plants, the entire layout and the structure and the feel of it, it feels very familiar. You have long steel and concrete buildings, administrative and management processes that are placing people into work areas or sections and divisions. It was being run like a corporation like Union Carbide or DuPont, for the very good reason that it was run by Union Carbide and DuPont. The government contracted with existing large-scale industrial employers for the creation of the Manhattan Project, and its organization and managerial structure, the architecture and physical buildings of it, had very much that feel and still does today. Now, you might think that a top secret weapons program aimed at creating a new weapon for the purposes of fighting World War II, at the end of the war, it could have wrapped up and shut down. But this was not at all the case with the Manhattan Project. After the end of the World War II, the industry didn't close up. To the contrary, it was really just the beginning, and a very small and early beginning to what was subsequently to grow into an enormous global worldwide endeavor. The US, after the Trinity test, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was to go on to subsequently conduct another 1,054 nuclear detonations as tests. It went on to produce a stockpile of nearly 30,000 warheads. And that was just in the weapons complex area. The Manhattan Project laboratories subsequently expanded their aims and aspirations into other areas of nuclear technologies. One of them was nuclear propulsion. From a short step from 1945-46 to 1953 with the Mark I reactor as a first attempt at a nuclear form of propulsion. And that was to work its way through the Navy for submarine propulsion, into the space program, into the aerospace programs as well, attempting various types of nuclear powered vessels, both in the water and in the air. It was also to grow very, very quickly into aspirations for harnessing the atom, the kind of new technology of nuclear energy, for the production of power. The Oak Ridge graphite pile reactor, which was, you remember, one of those three sites, the one that's close to North Carolina in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You've got a pile of graphite blocks assembled with fuel rods pushed through them. They're getting very, very hot as the reactor is operating. By 1948, they had plumbed small copper tubing through it, running water, and it was going to run a small toy steam engine, what was called a Jensen engine. That was the first, that engine spun around, the steam engine, turned a generator and lit a light bulb. That was the first demonstration in 1948 of a nuclear powered, using nuclear power for the generation of electricity. That quickly, by 1951, at the Idaho National Lab, they had an experimental reactor set up. Larger scale development of nuclear power moved from there. So Oak Ridge had a sister city in Obninsk, in what was then the Soviet Union. 1954, Obninsk began a much larger demonstration of electrification using nuclear power. The UK began its own nuclear program and built Calder Hall in 1956. The US shipping port in Pennsylvania had a reactor in 1957. So the industry was rapidly growing in the United States and expanding into not just the weapons complex, but propulsion for the nuclear navy primarily, and energy. And the labor force was growing very rapidly. The sites began to spread across the United States. So we get the Savannah River site in Aiken, South Carolina, the Idaho lab, which I mentioned, with the test site converted over from a conventional testing facility to a place where they were working on nuclear development. Rocky Flats in Colorado, Pantex in Texas, Fernald in Ohio. The nuclear government, the US government within the Atomic Energy Commission was to grow so large as to overtake General Motors in size of its labor force. And it wasn't just the United States, which only held a monopoly on nuclear technology for a very short period of time. Other countries began to follow and really paralleled both the efforts and in many ways, the administrative structure of, so we had the creation in Canada, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union very quickly by the late 40s and early 50s, growing up similar facilities, many of them viewed as sister sites, Obninsk looking like Oak Ridge. In France, Fontenay-aux-Roses was, again, building a graphite pile reactor, just as Oak Ridge had been. So the nuclear industry has expanded and now is really a global enterprise with lots of participants. From production, propulsion and engine, electrical power generation, all the way through to fabrication and reprocessing of fuels and handling of the waste. So that's created an enormous labor force. And there are certainly, for the people, hundreds of thousands of them working in this industry from the very birth, prior to the Trinity test, the people who worked on the development, all the way through to the people who built these enormous stockpiles of weapons. to the people who are downwind of the test sites where those have happened, the people who are living around the mining facilities, the fuel conversion, reprocessing, and waste disposal sites, the communities that are surrounding these laboratories, all have questions about what are the consequences of this still relatively new technology, something with its early origins in the 40s, despite the fact that in some ways we've lived in an environment with at least a baseline level of radioactivity since the beginning of history. But the nature of it has changed, and as I said, some of the hazards are completely novel and unique to this industry. How do we know then? If people are going to ask, what's the effect of what we've done and what we are doing? How do you answer those questions? At the very outset of the Manhattan Project, there was a clear appreciation about the dangers of this new industry. When Union Carbide and DuPont signed those contracts to take on the responsibility of building large-scale laboratories and recruiting tens of thousands of workers to work in them with something which was a novel hazard, but which early experience and intuition told them was going to be uniquely dangerous, the government had to exempt them from liability. They agreed to operate those facilities for the government during the war effort with the understanding that liability for endangerment was going to be borne by the federal government and not by the contractors who were running these sites. How did they know that it was going to be dangerous? You had the early experience with firstly, acute injuries, burns. The classic case is Pierre Curie, who worked on the separation of radium from uranium ores, who found that carrying a piece, a vial of radium around in his pocket was causing burns on one leg. And as a pure kind of perfect empiricist, he thought, well, that's strange. And so he took it out and placed it into the other pocket so going from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, and managed to kind of induce burns on the other leg as well, sort of demonstrating in a classic, this would be a medical experiment with a crossover design, first treating one side and then the other, and reaffirming kind of the evidence now strongly that it was the radium which was burning his skin. The long-term consequences of that were to be more serious than the burns, but those were acute and what used to be known as deterministic effects of high doses of radiation right against the skin. There were other people. In the slide, there's a picture. I hope that you can see this slide. Thomas Edison, and there's a man standing next to him. Thomas Edison's looking through, peering into what looks like a funnel. Next to him is Clarence Daly, who was working with him. Clarence Daly was to be one of the early deaths in the history of people working in industrial settings with ionizing radiation. He was manufacturing X-ray tubes, and they were looking through because they could see, in this case, not Edison's hand, but Daly's hand. And he was to suffer burns and then finally fatal metastatic skin cancer. And this was promptly followed by, I have in the middle of the panel of the slide, you can see lists of people. So we have 1902 with Daly, 1908, additional people, all of these people working in a single very small industry, the manufacturing of X-ray tubes at the very early ages of X-ray tube manufacturing, person after person suffering radiation injuries and fatal cancers. So that was being exposed to X-rays, which we're familiar with. They're invisible rays which can penetrate through the skin, penetrate through the body, and you can capture an image from the rays passing through you to get an X-ray looking at your bones or soft tissue or teeth. There was something else which was really signaling the manufacturers in the Manhattan Project of the nuclear weapons that there was a real concern, was the experience of, we have the figure on the far side, women painting radium dials. Radium was this unique material that Madame Curie had discovered. And very early on in the working with radium, you began to see people who were developing what they called radium jaw, but it was very, very small amounts of material taken into the mouth, either as a dust, or some people were what they call tipping the brushes, touching it against their tongue so that they could do this fine drawing of making glowing dials, painting the numbers on the faces of clocks or watches so that they glowed at night. And taking that in, and the radium was moving somewhat like calcium and embedding into the jaw, emanating out poisonous gases that were moving up into the nasal passage as a sort of radon gas. And these women were getting very, very high doses. The cases were battled first by the Industrial Commission, but finally it was recognized that this was radium poisoning in a very early experience. This was extremely concerning to people in the Atomic Energy Commission, as they were working with now tens of thousands of people working with materials that were going to be very similar to radium in the sense of posing potent dangers for the ingestion of very, very small particles, and what those could do and what those could mean for the risk of cancer. Okay, so those were what would be known as case reports. Very, very odd and strange occurrences of rare diseases, cancers of the jawbone, or Clarence Daly's burn of the hand, or Pierre Curie's burning of the left side and then right side of his leg. Those could be observed, and you could make some intuition about the hazard because they were exceptionally rare in the absence of exposure, and unique in their location and the presentation. Oral cancers in otherwise young, healthy women is something which you would not anticipate seeing. But the interpretation is often kind of an appeal to intuition. In large industrial cohorts, we'd like to be able to do more than that. We would like to be able to study things that are not only kind of extremely unusual and rare, in which we happen to notice by, let's say, good luck or happenstance, but how do we do a systematic surveillance on large groups of people so that we can understand what's happening? And that can become the basis for better informed protection of workers and the public in the long term, which is finally what we need today, because we are, whether we like it or not, surrounded now by a large industrial complex that's engaged in all these various aspects of servicing and operating kind of nuclear weapons, nuclear propulsion, nuclear power complexes. That was a consideration which was also appreciated by both the Atomic Energy Commission and by the corporate contractors who were running these sites, that there were needs to do some form of general understanding of the hazards they were working with in order to control them. Now, if you're an employer or you're the federal government, you may have different perspectives on kind of the rationale and needs for this than if you are, if you're an ordinary citizen who's concerned about their own welfare or their health and safety. From the government's perspective, one reason that they wanted to understand the hazards of the materials they were working with. So in the uranium enrichment and plutonium production complexes, developing up this weapon, first for the immediate wartime use, and subsequently the Cold Wartime use, the rush to produce more weapons than the Soviets. So there were concerns early on that if this was so dangerous, it could be lethal, and large proportion of the workforce could fall dead before they could develop the weapons. So impacts on wartime production, and this is well documented in the minutes of the Atomic Energy Commission's advisory board on radiation and health. There were also labor concerns. Were there going to be lawsuits? and worker concerns. So the industry was bringing this forward and the government was having to reassure people, and they needed to understand their liability. If people were harmed, there were going to have to be evaluations of compensation claims or decisions made. So they needed to know, was this very dangerous or less dangerous? There were people in the world of what's sometimes called industrial hygiene, the kind of promotion and establishment of standards for safe operation, in the same way that you work with other dangerous things like chemicals or other physical hazards. What would the standards be for working with plutonium? What would the basis for those standards be, and how do we assess their adequacy? At the same time, this was a huge novel scientific progress and program, and there were really interesting and curious questions developing. Prior to the Manhattan Project, Herman Mueller and people had begun working with X-rays and these novel emanations from radium and other isotopes, which were just being discovered, and finding that they were having curious and somewhat alarming effects. So the irradiation of fruit flies was a classic one. And you were beginning to see the effect, genetic damage, which appeared to be, if not lethal, in some cases heritable, inducing kind of mutations. And there was experimental work also with the irradiation of plants and mammals to study what were the effects being. So there was also an interest in studying the effects of ionizing radiation, this new compound, and what the biological effects were going to be, and what were the determinants of those effects. Was it long-term low-level exposure, or a peak and prompt acute exposure at a high dose that was necessary to create these effects? What was the nature of the biological response to different magnitudes of exposure under different dosing regimes? So if you were, these tools, X-rays, for example, and radiotherapy were being introduced into clinical settings. They were also being introduced into commercial settings. You may have seen pictures of shoe stores that began to use X-rays as kind of to aid in the fitting of shoes. Clinicians were using this in what was called pelvimetry in the 1940s to the precursor to ultrasound. Pregnant women would have their abdomen X-rayed so that they could get a sense of how the fetus was developing, and was it going to be an easy delivery or difficult delivery. So all of these were and still remain important, serious questions. Again, consequences largely of the Manhattan Project, as there was an explosion and diffusion of these technologies. The other side of this is environmental health questions. I had thought that those were concerns which emerged much, much later, and I only recently was surprised to learn that as early as the 1940s, the communities surrounding some of these facilities, here's two examples of publications in the 40s concerning Oak Ridge, Tennessee. That is, again, one of these facilities very, very early in the start of the Manhattan Project, and the place where the uranium enrichment was happening. And questions about, if we look at Oak Ridge and then also Los Alamos and Hanford, those three early sites, what were the health of the populations living around them, and how would those be addressed? I'd take a moment to say that the concerns and the ways that they're addressed are partly shaped by the nature of the towns themselves. Prior to the Manhattan Project, there was not really a city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. There was a very small village of Clinton, Tennessee. Oak Ridge, when they brought in tens of thousands of workers, they built the town de novo. They built a whole planned city there as a secret city in the middle of Tennessee. And similarly, kind of Los Alamos grew up out of almost nothing. And the Hanford Reservation itself, you can see the pictures of turning from basically a field of mud into what's now kind of a large Tri-Cities area. The creation of those towns was very much the nature of company towns. The employer, the Atomic Energy Commission, built the housing, brought the employees in, was essentially a sole employer for the city, built the hospitals, and then began to address the questions of what was the community health of the people residing in those towns. So in a company town, there are a number of challenges to understanding what the health effects of an employer may be. There are concerns about the registration and accuracy of registration of occupational diseases when a clinician may be employed by the serving members of the public who are employees, and the clinician himself or herself is also an employee of the same sole employer in a city. The intermingling of occupational and environmental hazards, so that people in the town may simultaneously be workers in a facility and residents. It becomes hard to disentangle the effects of the occupational from the environmental contamination. And you can have take-home exposures, and there are certainly examples of this. People wearing soiled work clothes back home and traipsing dusts into the household and causing contamination that way. So these were not and remain kind of contentious issues and difficult to disentangle and difficult to address in a fair way, appreciating kind of the what I'll call the epidemiology, but also the sociology and history of these towns, which are so closely tied to the nuclear complex itself, to the Manhattan Project. In the 1960s, there was the first serious attempt, in my opinion, to systematically begin to understand what the effects of the Manhattan Project had been and were going to be on the health of all those people who were engaged in that wartime effort to create a bomb, and then the subsequent efforts to expand that stockpile and expand the nuclear industry. The Atomic Energy Commission, the Atomic Energy Commission, I'll just note, is what today we call the Department of Energy. And prior to that, it was called the AEC. Launched an investigation into the question of was it feasible to use this kind of enormous amount of information and records that they had assembled during the wartime effort to investigate, as they said, any sort of correlation between long-term exposures to radiation by the people who worked in the industry and health events, the health and mortality or morbidity, the disease, among the people who worked in the Atomic Energy Commission's facilities. This was starting, so again, it's relatively short period of time. If you appreciate a new industry created between 1943 and 1945, by 1965, they're saying we should launch a study to study what's happened using these records. Now, why was it feasible? The creation of new cities, top secret cities, and in a new industry during a wartime effort meant, unlike lots of occupations or trades that you might imagine that we could study, like farming or carpentry, there was a defined date at which the industry commenced. Because it was a military endeavor that involved classified work, everybody, in order to get on site, had to have a real and true name, date of birth, social security number. there was a record constructed on each person who was going to come on site. And this was for management purposes as well as security and control purposes. They wanted to know who was there every day, why, and when. So they were obsessively keeping records, as only, let's say, military efforts can do. The other thing was they were issued a badge. So it had, in the very early days, a photographic image of the person who was going to come on it, their name, the locations at which they were permitted to enter, and something novel. So at the start of this industry, they realized that one of the ways that people could be exposed to radiation and potentially harmed, and that they needed to be under surveillance and potentially protected, was by X-rays or gamma rays, which are essentially very much like X-rays, high energy photons that were going to come off the materials they were working with and pass through the body. And the way that they could detect those was by having people, primarily in that photograph, that badge that they had to wear in order to walk around the site and not be arrested, would have what was called a dosimeter. What was that? In the early days, that was a piece of dental film, the same film that you used to do a dental X-ray, and it was in the back of the badge. And when the X-rays or gamma rays would hit the person and pass through them, the film would progressively get more and more dark. So that was called a film badge dosimeter. It just meant it was a piece of photographic film which got darker and darker proportional to how much X-rays. Now, the reason that it wasn't light, they were in a light sealed container, but the X-rays could pass through it and make the film get dark. That was embedded into the badge as well. And you would turn your badge in and get a new one every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks. It mattered where you were. If you were in a more dangerous zone, you would change your badge out more frequently. So there were detailed logbooks, records that told how much radiation they had been exposed to. If there was concern that they were breathing in dusts, they would also give a urine sample. And early on, they had little trucks that looked like milk trucks going around to these factory houses that the companies had built, collecting urine samples and processing them on a routine basis. All of this became a repository of information for putting together large lists of tens of thousands of people who were individually wearing badges, measuring their X-ray exposures every day at work, periodically collecting what are called biological samples of particles that they might have swallowed, that they could count in their urine, for example. And those were the records for this correlation study of the occupational exposures and the diseases. Now, I'll note that the person, you can see his name at the top, who was issuing this report, was Thomas Mancuso, and he was well chosen at the time. He was somebody that was well liked and trusted by many of the unions and the workers. He had a history of providing advice to workers on occupational health and safety, and writing a column which was very popular at the time and in trade magazines that went to union members. I'll also note that Dr. Mancuso worked from 1965 to 1974, a very long period of time assembling this information. And as we'll see, it was abruptly taken away from him because the Atomic Energy Commission was not satisfied with his work, and he felt badly about that history. So he worked from 1965 to 1974, largely in basements and record halls of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the Hanford site out in Washington, Los Alamos National Labs, and a few of the other newly emerging facilities that are part of the Manhattan Project. And what he was doing was going through all those records and doing the early work of computerization of information that had been originally recorded on paper records. So this was back in the days of what were called computer punch cards, paper cards, and you punched out holes and read it through a machine, and the computer in this way would digitize the information. This was before flatbed scanners and everything else, the early age of computing. But he computerized these records, and that's become the basis for still much of the work that's done today in this area. he would have been happily doing that for many more years and assembling the information in a systematic way so that he could report it out in a kind of, let's say, slow but careful way. But he was forced to abruptly change course. What happened was in 1974, the Department of Health for the state of Washington had a man named Samuel Millam who worked there. He was one of the heads for the Division of Environmental Health for the state of Washington. He periodically, as an epidemiologist, was looking at the proportions of deaths in Washington state due to different causes among people who were employed in different trades, and issued a report that there was a greater proportion of deaths than expected among people who worked in the nuclear industry. And this was largely associated with that Hanford nuclear reservation, which was one of the 3 Department of Energy sites out in Washington state. This caused like some public attention, and the Department of Energy said, it's time for you, Thomas Mancuso, to get out of the basements and the record halls, and we've been paying you. Now we want you to assemble that information and issue a rebuttal. Dr. Mancuso wasn't comfortable with that. He felt like his work wasn't done and he wasn't going to rush to publish. Abruptly, the project was just simply taken away from him and transferred to people who were sole employees of the Department of Energy, the Atomic Energy Commission. And they began to work on issuing results and pulling the data out from Dr. Mancuso and issuing reports. They looked something like this. Comparisons of the observed number of deaths to the expected numbers for, let's say, white males in the state of Washington or white males in the US overall. The conclusions were there didn't appear to be a substantial excess. And in fact, for many of the causes of death, there was, among the more highly exposed workers, there tended to be fewer deaths due to not simply all causes, but for all cancers, perhaps these rare forms of leukemias or lymphomas, multiple myeloma being one of them. There could be a slight excess that was in the very bottom row of this table here. Among the highest exposed workers, there were 3 cases observed and less than a half of a case expected. That was notable to them. But overall, these tended to be healthy people, which is not surprising given their paid employees in a relatively selective industry, and they have some advantages over the general population. This was not very satisfying, though, when it came to Mancuso eventually did issue rebuttals, and there was a back and forth which went on for years in the press with debates over these findings. And it went all the way to congressional hearings about the different conclusions that were happening between different groups of investigators over this question. In the 1980s, some of the work of Dr. Mancuso began to kind of further come to light. So it wasn't just the Hanford site, which was the one which was initially debated. Oak Ridge National Laboratories in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, there was a report, and there was a report of what appeared to be some significant excess of cancer among those workers. In the UK, reports were also coming out from the Atomic Energy Authority, which is like the Atomic Energy Commission of the US. Sellafield, which is the British version of the Hanford plant in the US, had some reports. So there were a sequence of papers, but I would say the general impression at the time was there were periodic or episodic findings of some elevations of risk, but most of them were statistically imprecise. There seemed to be a lot of noise in the information, and there wasn't a coherent vision of what the relationship was between employment in this industry and the risk of cancer. There were different excesses appearing at different facilities in different countries. There was an attempt by the World Health Organization in the 1990s to start to consolidate the information. First, combining information from Canada, the UK, and the United States into a report that led to some interesting suggestions. More notable around the same period of time, though, were findings that were beginning to come out of the former Soviet nuclear complex. Places like Mayak, which again would be, not the UK version of the Hanford site, but the Soviet version of the Hanford site, the place where they were making plutonium and enriching it. Large industrial facilities running very large reactors to irradiate uranium fuel and then dipping it into baths to dissolve off the metals that were around and separating out the plutonium to create the Soviet nuclear weapons stockpile, just as the US was running its program to create the US nuclear weapons stockpile, and the UK, to a smaller scale, was creating their nuclear weapons. The findings from the experience of the workers in the former Soviet Union was interesting and provocative, but the working conditions were so much different, and in many cases so much worse than those that were experienced in the US, the UK, France, and Canada. The magnitudes of the exposures were much higher, and the amount of contamination, internal exposures that people were taking from breathing in, swallowing or inhaling radioactive particles and dusts, those things which at the very start of the Atomic Energy Commission, you remember, the operators were so concerned about, working with extremely dangerous particles where the intake of small amounts could have extremely serious health effects. So this, now in parallel, coming around the year 2000, multiple lines of evidence or streams of evidence, some of it coming from much higher exposures in the former Soviet complex, and the assembling or the consolidation of information from North American and European nuclear enterprises. So much of this is relatively recent, I would have to say. In the last decade, that the assembling of information has expanded and increased. And here I'm just showing over the last, let's say, 10 years or so, some of the notable results. In Asia, the assembling of cohorts of workers, and so the Korean nuclear workers, for example, the Japanese nuclear workers, their nuclear industries started much later. They're much more recent than the experiences of the early allies in the nuclear states, Canada, France, the UK, and US, and on the other side, the Soviet experience. But the kind of the large and kind of informative studies, the ones where we have large numbers of cases, if we look at across the columns, not just the years that were being published, not just the number of workers, but the number of cancer cases, which accrue over time as people are followed year over year. Really where a lot of the information is coming from is from the US, the UK, and France. And what we've done in recent years is to bring those three countries together, focus our attention on them, focus on sort of the comparability of the experience of those workers, finding parallels where we can, understanding how each of those countries controlled exposures and measured them, what types of badges people were wearing in different years, and assembled those. And that's a program. Let's just take a few minutes here as we're getting towards the end to talk about, which was known as INWORKS, the International Nuclear Workers Study, which at this point has assembled probably, it's the largest and most informative study of this question of what is the effect of long-term low-level exposures to radiation, going back to the Manhattan Project and the experience in multiple countries. So it's 308,000 people who are all wearing these badged dosimeters and have been followed for nearly 70 years at this point. So from the 1940s forward, over which period of time, 18,000 cancer cases were seen. And what's the conclusion? That even these low levels of exposures in relatively kind of well-controlled work environments, this is different than the nuclear complex in the Soviet Union, for example, are associated with proportional increases in the risks of most forms of cancer. So if we look at just all cancers combined, we're showing in this table, rows are different types of categories of causes of death that people could die from. Cancers other than leukemias, and I'll talk about the last one, cancers other than leukemias and lung. Large numbers of cancers that we can observe, and then what's the percent excess cancer that people are having per unit radiation exposure. So per gray, which is a sizable amount of radiation to receive, these workers would have about a 50% excess of all forms of cancer for every gray of radiation, which is passing through their body. That would be a large dose of radiation, would be causing a 50% increase. But that's proportionally goes down. If you get 1/10 of a gray, you're going to have a 5% excess, or 1/100th of a gray, 0.5% excess. That's true of all solid cancers. It's not just driven by the leukemias. It's about the same for cancers other than leukemia, because leukemia is just a small fraction of all the types of cancers that one could get. If you take the lung cancers out as one way of saying, let's take out the primarily smoking related cancers and look at those. This cancers other than leukemias and lungs still are proportionally increasing with the amount of radiation that was measured on these people's badges. The leukemias you see, they're much rarer, but the excess is much larger per gray. So if you have a gray of radiation passing through you as a worker, it's not a 50% excess of leukemia, it's about a 300% excess, a tripling of the risk of leukemia. The lymphomas, there maybe is a small percent increase in that, but it's primarily leukemias. So this would be things like acute myeloid leukemia, or you may have heard of acute lymphocytic leukemia. Those are increasing in really large proportion. And this is something which is consistent with what was seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example. After the atomic bomb went off, the first, what was known as A-bomb disease that was noticed among the survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, within a few years after the detonation, a very large increase in the risk of leukemia. Here, in the setting of workers, we're having doses that are so much lower than those experienced by the people who survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but repeated low levels of exposure over years of working in a factory that was relatively well regulated, let's say. Nonetheless, they get a tripling of the risk of leukemia for every gray of radiation that they would receive. And again, I'll note, many of the workers did not receive anything near a gray. Most of them did not, but many of them could have had a 1/10 of a gray. I'll just end up here. The UK has recently continued to follow their workers, and they're seeing similar patterns. In fact, we see similar trends in each of the countries that we examined, the US, the UK, and France. By bringing the information together, we get much more precision and a clearer story than we get with any one of those countries examined separately. But so I've talked for quite a long time, maybe almost all of the time. So I'll stop and see if there are questions at this point. I'll stop.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that talk. That is really quite both illuminating and distressing. I'm looking to see if we have other participants, and we're having, I have to.
Stephen, this is Ashley. I'm working as the tech on this. I have the questions actually pulled up on Facebook, so I can go ahead and facilitate those if that's easier. Okay, so let's see. First question, can you talk a little bit more about the private partners that were involved with the Manhattan Project?
All right, we should be okay now.
Good. Yeah, so the Oak Ridge facility early on, Union
All right.
Carbide was the prime contractor, I believe, and then DuPont took over. DuPont had a large role to play in operation of the Hanford facility, and then the Savannah Riverside as well. Westinghouse played an important role. There have been some, those would be big early players. Over time, control has shifted as other people have bid for the contract to be the prime contractor. Los Alamos was run for a long period of time by the University of California system, which was interesting, but turned out to be quite problematic because that became the basis for them to withhold records, even from people who were commissioned by the federal government, such as myself, to conduct investigations of the health of their workers. The University of California then claimed states' rights and that their state rights to privacy of Los Alamos records through the state of California could not be overruled by the federal government in ordering them to share records. I've never quite understood how that worked, but access at many of the sites has been difficult. DuPont had an impressive history of records retention, and maybe partly reflecting a history of them having a lot of managerial concerns about health and safety with some of the processes that they were conducting. So maybe I'll stop there, but yeah, some heavy players certainly have been operators at these facilities.
Okay, and another question specifically about the Manhattan Project. What went into the decision of where those main labs were going to be located, such as Tennessee, Washington, New Mexico?
You know, those are great questions, and there's been some historical work to understand them. Part of it was finding isolated locations because they were attempting to. They wanted these conducted in secret. The early separations activity, for example, at the Y12 facility, sits in a gully between two hills. It was easily defensible and remains well defended. So I advise you not to try and wander on site, although people have. Another aspect was an intention for compartmentalization, that somebody working at one site would never have a clear view of the entire process. So as little as possible, you had people moving between, getting a clear overall picture. So they wanted them spread out. They didn't want the entire weapon being assembled at one single location. So you separated Los Alamos, where some of the work on the design and metallurgy, the formation of the metals and how those spheres were going to be assembled, and that work was being separate from the uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge and the plutonium production at the Hanford site. So rural places, they wanted, at the Hanford site, I believe, they wanted access to water from the Columbia River, primarily as cooling. They scoped out other sites for sure, and for a while they were imagining doing the weapons testing in the Outer Banks off the North Carolina's coast, for example, and there were other places as well. That at some point they realized that I think that the prevailing winds would have carried the plume over maybe larger fraction of the continental United States than it did when they did their detonation at the Trinity site. Yeah, it's certainly that history is fascinating as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, David. Stephen, did you need to, I'm sorry, David, did you have more to say? Or
No.
Okay, Stephen, did you have some other stuff to talk about before we wrap up this session? Okay, well, thank you so much, David. Stephen, did you need to, I'm sorry, David, did you have more to say? Or, okay, Stephen, did you have some other stuff to talk about before we wrap up this session?
I don't have anything further, no. I just wanted to thank you again, David, for this talk. It was really very informative. I appreciate the information.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody. And thanks for your attention as well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.